All right, grab devotional classics. All right, now we're on John Chrysostom. He's a church father, and he is a great coach on dealing with sin. You ever get discouraged dealing with sin? Especially when it keeps happening again and again and again, and you keep confessing, and it keeps happening, and you keep confessing, it keeps happening. He's a great coach at that point. He would never yell at you for that problem. Neither would Christ, actually. Take a look at section 4. And how am I to go back again? That is to say, to go back to the Father. He's thinking of the parable of the prodigal son. How can I go back again when I've already gone back so many times? And we're tempted what? To stop finally going back. He says, how am I to go back again? Start back by avoiding vice, going no farther into it. Now, it's very interesting. It doesn't say necessarily you're going to be able to stop whatever the particular vice is, but he says, don't go more deeply into it, go no further, and your deeds of wickedness will have an end. And then I like this. If you do so for 2 days, say you have a deeply ingrained pattern of sin that's troubling you. His point is, if you go for 2 days without committing that particular act of sin, then he says, you'll keep off on the 3rd day more easily. You're starting to form a new habit. And after 3 days, you'll add 10, then 20, then 100, then your whole life. So it's a kind of progressive healing. Does that make sense? A progressive healing, where we're gentle with ourselves. So you might think that one through. And then if we go 3 or 4 days and that pattern reappears, it is useless simply for us to punish ourselves and self-flagellation and I'll never change. No, no, no. At that point, you just run to Christ. You run to Christ. And you cling to Him. You cling to His cross. All the forgiveness that's available there. And you start again. The worst sin would be to give up. That's the worst sin, to think you'll never change and just give up. Why would that be the worst sin? Because He hung on the cross for all your sins. So cling to Christ. Cling to Christ. All right, last one from Devotional Classics has to do with Watchman Nee. And Watchman Nee, he coaches here. Now, since we're going to move right now into the last spiritual discipline we'll talk about today. The last spiritual discipline we're going to talk about is the discipline of confession. It's one of my favorite spiritual disciplines, if you can love a spiritual discipline. And I love it because I've just seen what can happen to people when we learn how to deal with our sin. And the section I'd like you to take a look at here with Watchman Nee is the friend of sinners, section 3. Can you think of a single instance where someone has been involved in sin of some kind, comes to Jesus, falls on their knees, and says, Lord, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. Can you think of a single instance when he reacts to them negatively? When he yells at them or turns away from them or seems disgusted with them? A single instance? I haven't been able to find one. Who are the people that he gets upset with? He gets upset with self-righteous people. He gets upset with people who do not see their own need. Not only do they not see their own need, but self-righteous people do what to other people? They judge them. And oftentimes in their judgment, they're really condemning themselves because self-righteous people tend to project their own sin onto somebody else and they judge it in that other person. John Stott. Some of you know that name, John Stott? He's a well-known preacher. I happened to be attending a conference early 80s. There's a group of 6 or 7 of us in his apartment, and he told this funny story, but it's sad. It shows this danger of projection. He's with a pastor. They're in the tube in London. They're walking, taking the escalator down into the tube. And of course, in European airports, they're selling everything, and they're using sex to sell it. So there's these beautiful models, and they don't have as much on as they probably need to have on, and so on and so forth. And this pastor, he said, just began to be so irate. This is the problem in London. Look at these women on the wall. They're wearing a stitch. He's really mad. He is so angry. John goes to get on the tube, turns around, and this man has got back on the escalator. He's heading up, still ranting. He got so caught up in what he was seeing. Well, guess what? He's struggling with pornography, as it turns out. And it was so hard for him to face that, so what he was doing was projecting it and judging it. And that anger he was expressing was really anger at himself, because he couldn't change it. So Nee says Christ is a friend of sinners. You can't have a better friend than that. He's not a friend of the righteous, meaning self-righteous at this point. He's a friend of sinful people. And he willingly enters into a relationship with sinful people, and then what does he ask them to do? He asks them to change. And you get these wondrous stories in the gospel. They're just so extravagant about forgiveness. Stories like the woman who's set up by these mean-spirited, self-righteous Pharisees, and she's caught in the very act of adultery. Remember that story? That's in John chapter 8. Then they say to Jesus, as the law says, those caught in adultery must be stoned, Rabbi. And Jesus says, all right. He who is without sin among you, cast the first stone. And finally they all walk away. And he says, woman, where are your accusers? Go and sin no more. See, he expects change. He doesn't want to go back and sleep with the same man. He expects change, but he forgives her. The wondrous thing about Jesus Christ is he knows how to deal with people's sin. And some of the greatest sinners were the apostles themselves. Think of Peter. We talked about Peter. It's a wondrous thing to me that when he sees Jesus in John 21 standing on the shoreline, he dives into the water and starts swimming toward Jesus. One would have thought he would have swum in the opposite direction. Why? He knew, catch it now, he knew that Jesus would know what to do with what he had done. He knew. So, some basic principles, both about the discipline of confession, and then as I look at you, one of my hopes for you is this, is that you all would become people of holiness, but also become people who are approachable, loving, so that if another person is struggling with sin A, B, or C, they would know you're safe to come to, and they would know you're going to be able to help them at that point. So here's some basic principles. Here is what happens. This is what I would call the cycle of sin. See it here? So an act of sin takes place. And because you're a moral creature created in the image of God, you've got a conscience, and your conscience kicks in, and you begin to feel guilt. And then almost all of us will feel this deep, deep sense of isolation with thinking like this: no one else has ever done something like this. I'm the only one who could possibly struggle with this sin. And how could I ever share what I've done with another person? And in all probability, if there's not an intervention at that point, what's going to happen? The sin will repeat itself. It's habitual. What we need is someone to come alongside that person and offer Christ to them. But it has to be very concretely. So for instance, I was once working with someone and they had a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior, had to do with their sexual life, and it was repeating itself. And I said, I'm going to call you next Friday, because that's when the pattern of behavior would usually occur. It was on a Friday evening. I'm going to call you Friday around 8:30. We'll have a chat to see how you're doing. This is after a long, extended discussion, and confession had taken place. And surely enough, I called this person up at 8:30 on a Friday night, and he was almost ready. Off he goes to commit that act of sin again. But we just talked, and the pattern of behavior was broken for the first time. Now, I had to keep calling him up on a Friday night for a while. But finally, I thought, all right, I'm not going to call him. And I really wanted to call him. Because I thought, oh, man, what's going to happen? And he saw me on church that following Sunday with a big smile on his face, and he said, I think we're past this. See how that cycle of sin was broken? Bringing Christ into that situation, offering Christ to that person, but then helping. In this case, just being a friend who would come alongside and say, how you doing? How can I help? So when we talk about Jesus accepts those who come to him, but the wonderful thing is, he doesn't tell them that something's okay that's not okay. When we do that, that's kind of a misplaced kindness. It's a misplaced kindness because we take hope away from somebody. See, so if somebody comes to us, their conscience is engaged, the Holy Spirit is touching them, and they want to change. And if they come to us and say, I'm struggling with A, and we say, oh, it's not a problem, well, I can tell you how I used to feel in those days when misguided Christians would tell that to me before I was in the kingdom. Since this is being filmed, I won't tell you what I said, but I thought, you are more fouled up than I am. I know it's wrong. I just can't change. Give me some hope here. Give me some hope, and misplaced kindness takes away hope. What Christ does is he talks very gently to people like that woman in John 8. They were right about one thing. Those men were right about one thing. It was adultery. And you got to stop. But he doesn't leave us alone at that point. So confession is a matter of trust. Don't you have to really trust somebody to open up those dark areas? You have to trust that they're not going to judge you. You have to trust that they're not going to condemn you. You have to trust that they're not going to go tell their friends what you've just told them. So to receive someone's confession is an art, and a grace-filled art, I would argue. Trust. So, be specific. Don't euphemize at this point. Again, remember what euphemization is. It's using a word that somehow lessens the gravity of a situation. It's the SS at Auschwitz in their records saying, we processed 10,000 units today. Well, they'd killed 10,000 people. That's euphemization. Name it for what it is. So if it's greed, it's greed. If it's envy, it's envy. If it's anger, anger. Avarice, avarice. Name it. Somehow the power of whatever it is gets snapped at that point. In the very naming, Christ begins to move into that situation. Now, people are going to come to you. As you're more deeply formed and shaped into Christ's image, they're going to come to you and they're going to want to talk. Bonhoeffer calls it living under the cross. And Foster says, anyone who's learned to live under the cross becomes increasingly unshockable. Unshockable. Because that person knows, if you live under the cross, you know, I know, I'm just as capable of doing whatever this person has just said to me. That's the kind of self-awareness that grows as we live under the cross. I'm just as capable, apart from the grace of God. So how could I be sitting here in some way judging them when they finally have the courage to come and say, I am royally screwed up and I need help, and this is what I've been doing. Now, at that point in time, our body language is really important. So you don't want to stiffen up, you don't want to look away, you don't want to look down, you don't want to get a frown on your face, whatever, and if that's hard, do this. Just imagine in your mind's eyes, you're looking at that person. Imagine Christ between you and that person. See him. If you need to, see him on the cross. And what that does is it diffuses this tendency we have to start shaking our finger in somebody's face or to be repulsed by what they've said. And as you can see here, just pray for them because it's just so wonderful. My goodness, it's just so wonderful that somebody finally has the courage to come to you and say, I need help. Can you help bring Christ to me somehow? I am stuck. The result of confession is number one, forgiveness, and number two, freedom. Two good words. Number one, forgiveness. Number two, freedom. Particularly if we stay in somebody's life and help move them to a new place.